Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, to another episode in Conversations in the Future of Work. I am your host, Rachel Kosser, and it is a delight to welcome two very special guests on today's episode, where we'll explore getting comfortable with discomfort. As many of you may remember, the word for 2023 was authenticity. And oftentimes in coaching and when we're pushing ourselves to grow, we can find ourselves feeling conflicted between the person we may have been attached to and who we actually are evolving into through some of that coaching. So I thought, given these two individuals and their experience in innovation, leadership, and leadership coaching, this would be a really interesting topic to explore. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our incredible guests, Seth Rigoletti and Ken Grady. So Seth, if you want to just share a few things about yourself and what you think might be relevant for our audience to know.
Thanks, Rachel. So great to be here. Thanks for inviting us. And I'm a leadership coach. I do work with executives and teams, helping them to communicate more authentically, more clearly, and draw stronger connections between each other. So I'll work individually on presence and that, and I'll also work with groups on helping them coordinate. And I'm here today with my co-conspirator, Ken Grady, who I've done almost a decade worth of work with in with his team. And then also we started a podcast together. Ken, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, it's great to be here. As Seth mentioned, he and I have worked together quite a while. I'm a SVP, Senior Vice President, and CIO of IDEX Laboratories, which is a global animal health and diagnostics company and leader. I've actually worked in the pharmaceutical, vaccines and diagnostics and development area on the human side for most of my career, but always in technology. And nearly always in technology, but leading IT functions, leading software development, leading new product development. And what I think is so interesting and something that really inspired Seth and I to start this work on leadership in a different way was in the past few years, especially, we've seen that technology is this constant source of change. It's changed the way we engage with our customers. It's changed the way that businesses go to market. It's changed the ways that we work with each other as colleagues and collaborators. And all of that has meant that we have to get very comfortable with change and leading change. And that's really where a lot of this has come from, is that really unpacking and exploring kind of how do we get comfortable with leading change and being changed ourselves as a part of that.
Absolutely. So let's, you've laid the foundations beautifully, Ken, for the first question, which I'll pass over to you. So in your experience, right, and whether you want to reference the past like 3 acute years of change or just in general, what are some of the most powerful skills you think a leader needs to develop to meet today's wild world of work?
Many years ago when I started this role, as folks do when you're taking on a new role, right? Day one, day two, they asked me, get up in front of the team and tell them stuff, tell them the vision, tell them the whatever. And I was like, I just joined this organization leading a few hundred people distributed around the world on different sites. And literally the first week, I said, I don't even know where the bathrooms are. You all know more about the business and the team and the software we're developing. But there's a couple of things I do know. And one thing I know, and again, stepping into a role leading a technology organization, I said, whatever you're working on today, you won't be working on that 3 years from now. Right? That's just the pace of change. And that was almost a decade ago, joining this organization. I've been in the role. It's only gotten faster. And so what does that mean? What can we do about that? And one of the things we talk a lot about is designing for change, designing resilience for change, being open to and accepting of change, being curious about what's possible next. And those are skills that's not like a technical skill. That's not like there's technology and stuff that goes into it, but that's a skill as a leader that just creating the mindset within the organization that change is going to happen. And wouldn't it be great if we're the authors of that change and we're designing for it? And so that's that resilience and curiosity between the two of them. Those are things that I look for in new leaders or growing leaders.
Right. That's so interesting. And especially as these organizations or the organizations you work for become more complex and larger and more distributed, I would imagine that building processes that allow for that resilience to change, I mean, that's got to be a whole project in and of itself.
It is. And actually the distributed part is an area where I have a special kind of interest in, coming out of, COVID and lockdown and kind of the way we all changed the way we worked every day, becoming very intentional about that part of the process and conversation and the resilience, and listening really hard to what the team needs to ensure we stay connected and unified in purpose has become, I think that's the part where my takeaway in the last few years was we had to get really intentional about this in a way that you sort of could be lazy about. If you're all in the same place together and you have a chance to catch up over coffee or stuff in the, in the line or in the lunchroom, you can't do that anymore. And especially in a larger, kind of more complex organization. So that creating some intentionality and talking about what that means, how different people are going to receive that, has been a big part of what Seth and I have been working on this past couple of years.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that the intentionality piece is particularly difficult when we look at, a lot of times leaders don't actually, they have this clear idea of a process that they would like to go through, but they're not always so curious about where people are in that process. So there can be sometimes this feeling of like you're trying to drive all the cattle into a fenced in area, and that works really well if all you want are cattle. But a lot of times what we want people to actually be thinking independently. We want them like contributing. We want them actually like telling us what's going on, because we don't have full visibility, especially with a distributed organization. So we need this like conversational quality to it. And we're just terrible at it. Like, even these situations now with the video stuff, we tend to be just talking at people and not really making space for listening or for quiet.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so, Seth, like there's even if you take something as simple as facilitating a video call or conversation, right? There's so much more that's going on in each of our respective environments that the people on the other end are not privy to, right? And so I think there's something, Seth, to your point of like, how do you find out where each individual is on their journey of being curious and being able to stomach some of that change or get on board with change, right? That like, how do you, as a coach, how do you guide leaders in developing a skill set to not only being curious to where people are in their different journeys, but how to find out where they are? Like, what kinds of questions might they be able to ask?
Yeah, I think what I tend to do with most of my leaders that I work with, and Ken and I talk about this a lot in our podcast, is you got to start off with being curious about yourself. Like what is going on for you? What is actually happening in your world right now? And then, do some discernment about what about that you can share with the team. What about that? Because the vulnerability you bring to a group is going to invite vulnerability from that group. It's not necessarily going to be one-to-one, but it creates a safer space. And I think most leaders think of themselves as like these tabula rasas, like these completely blank slates where they're just there to like get information from everybody else or to extract information. And that creates a power dynamic that doesn't allow for that kind of interference. What do you think about that, Ken, from your experience?
Yeah, I think it was making me chuckle a little bit because long ago and far away, as I was growing up as a leader, you just kind of get this, I don't know, this thing where, okay, I'm going to go to work now and I'm going to put my business on. And you become kind of this almost like one or two dimensional kind of facade that you put on. And what happened during COVID when we all went home, right, and worked from wherever we were, and it was challenging. Don't get me wrong. Like we were all white knuckled. Like, I don't know if we all remember that. We were like trying to get through it and trying to keep together and trying to like figure out what's going to happen. Is the world on fire? But suddenly you got this glimpse into people's worlds in a way that you didn't before. And they got a glimpse into my world in a way that they didn't before. And, I made a rule early on. It was like I had kids at home still. They were in school and doing homeschool, and they could come in anytime. The printer's in my office. They could come in anytime and interrupt me. My dogs come in. I'm not in my home office today because we're kind of mixing it up, but I've got like a musical show poster behind me because I'm big into musical theater. You just got this sudden sense, and it was this accidental lesson for me in terms of, oh, well, if they can see my messy world, then it's not as like scary to share your mess as well and ask for help or get to know each other in a different way. It was the irony of the whole situation was actually by becoming more distributed in that way, we got to know each other in a way that we never would have otherwise.
That's an interesting point. I think, I feel like Seth, you and I have talked about this in the past, but something about that, I think there's two things, Ken, that come up for me when you share that. Number one is, as a leader, people are looking to you to take their cues, right? And people will only go so far as you go, right? And so if that is in you sharing vulnerability or you showing up and sharing more sides of yourself, right? And with the virtual environment at home, you have the opportunity to put things in your background. Like my co-founder has like 19 guitars behind him because he's such like a music buff. But it's wonderful because that's something you would never have seen just in the office, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing. So let's move on to our next question here, because now we're talking about some of that change. And especially, Ken, to your point earlier of people tend to show up in professional circles as, this is me as a professional, and I'm almost de facto leaving certain qualities of my other self out. So how do you navigate? And Seth, I'd be curious, especially your perspective here as a coach, but like, how do you help people navigate out of your comfort zone while still helping people stay true to that, like that authentic core?
Do you want me to answer that first, or do you want Ken to?
Yeah.
So I would start off by saying that for me, I don't like to think of my authentic self as a fixed state, as sort of like an absolute. I think that one of the things that is authentic for me is when I'm outside my comfort zone, I can get uptight and I can get a little fearful. And I think that also is authentic. I think that the piece about what's hard for leaders is that we have this idea in our minds that we're supposed to be this absolute, this concept of Ken was just talking about this concept of this leader. I always have to know the answer. I always have to know what to do. I always have to know how to handle the situation. And I think that to make this distinction, that one of the ways that you navigate that as a leader is to be honest about where you are, but not need the team to support you emotionally, not need the team to tell you that you're doing a good job. I think as soon as a leader falls into that category, you trigger in everybody on the team some sort of caretaker role, and then the leader lose your authority. But you can actually be authentic and say, like, hey folks, like, I don't really know what to do here. I'm really curious about what you all think is happening and what you all think you would do in this situation. And we have a lot of great examples of this over the course of the last 150 years about leaders who have been in terrible situations and have done this. But go ahead, Ken, you chime in on you have a good take on this too.
Yeah, there's this metaphor we talked about in one of the early episodes of the podcast. It's Not Personal podcast, around this what Seth was touching on around, as a leader, how do I continue to grow and not stay safe and in my comfort zone? Because comfort is static and it's safe generally, and it means you're not learning and growing. And one of the things that I really, again, talk about a lot with my team is to Seth's point, none of us know everything, and none of us should expect that we have to pretend like we know everything. And so we're going to always, there's never anybody I've met or worked with that hasn't had something to teach me. Every day, I learn stuff every day from my team and the people I work with. It's amazing. I always love working with smart people. And this metaphor we use is, and you'll appreciate this, or maybe your co-founder would appreciate this, because I like music as well. And we talk about operating like a jazz band. And we're all pulling in the same direction. Somebody sets the general tone, right? But if you ever listen to a really good jazz band, any instrument, any musician can be in the lead at any given time. And in fact, almost every one of them will be in the lead at any given time. And what it means for the rest of you is you have to listen really hard to know how to support them and know when it's your turn to lead and step out of your comfort zone or step into the front, and know that you're going to have the support and the trust of the organization you're working with. It does require, at Seth's point, this high degree of trust that you're working on to, and again, share, like, I'm good at this, I'm good at that type of scenario, not as good at this other type of scenario, and I'm going to need your help with it. And when you build that level of trust, they know when to step in. Your colleagues, your team knows when to step in to support you. And, you know, that's why you surround yourself, like, hey, the best trumpet player in the world is probably not a great bass player, right? That's reality. Maybe they want to learn, right? But that's the kind of way that we operate in a way that allows to create the space, I think Seth mentioned earlier, to try something out of your comfort zone and know that you've got the support.
Right. And so in that sense, do you find that like part of that fear of leaving your comfort zone is like, yes, one, somewhat identity based, but then also rooted in a fear of taking that step and then failing, possibly?
Absolutely. I think this is the sorry, Seth. No, I think this is, I've heard this referred to as, like, you know, the fear of the first time, right? And the first time you're trying something, you just got to ground yourself. You're probably not going to be good at it unless you're a savant. You're probably not going to be good at it. And so that's where I think just kind of that self conversation around, oh, I see what's happening here. Oh, I'm in a first time situation. You know, Brene Brown talks about this in some of her work she does around vulnerability and authenticity. And, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to give myself the grace and ask for help, or give myself the time to find my feet before moving forward. But it's something we should expect because we're humans. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I think it's also true. We forget this, that we're designed to kind of try to avoid difficulties. Like, we want to our brains are inherently lazy. Like, we want to try to conserve energy, and so we have all these heuristics, these biases that we develop over time. Some of them are handed down, but some of them are things that we just, we just do automatically. We think about the world through this lens of bias. And so once we've accomplished some level of success in our job, in our career, we naturally have an aversion to change, to things that are going to force us to be bad at it. And I think that there are some people in this world who, they make a big deal out of the fact that they love change, and those people, God bless them, but they're like, can be very disruptive as leaders, because you don't want leaders who are constantly coming in just to change everything, just to do it. You want leaders who are changing things really because things have to change, right? Because if we don't change, we're gonna crumble, or we're gonna languish, and you want leaders who are not afraid of that, right? So we as individuals, we have to cultivate a practice that puts us in a place where we are going to be uncomfortable from time to time.
Yeah. That actually tees me up perfectly for this next question, because I find, so in my experience, having been a gymnast and a professional ballet dancer, like, I definitely saw frequently people pushing themselves way too far out of their comfort zones. So how do you, like, first of all, have you seen instances of that where people, Seth, you alluded to it a little bit, saying that sometimes leaders come in and they just want to change and disrupt just for the sake of maybe the energy around it. But like, Seth, what do you think about, like, how might you know if maybe you've been in a zone of discomfort for too long?
Oh, I love the concept of ballet, just thinking about this, because ballet itself as an art form is pushing human beings to do the most unnatural, right? They're trying to create a very unnatural line with their bodies. So it takes tremendous practice, tremendous discipline. You have to just work so hard outside your comfort zone every single day to do things that your body really isn't technically going to do naturally, right? So I would start off just by saying, we don't really know, right? We don't really know what that outside the comfort zone is. And in dance, they talk about this wanting to push yourself to the point where you start to vibrate, and acting, it's the same thing. Like you want to push yourself to a place where you start actually feeling the vibration. A good leader is somebody who understands that place with their team, where they're saying, no, you go take this, you present this, you take on this project yourself. And they're delegating something that they know is outside. And Ken, you're great at this, so you'll talk about this, but like you're delegating something that is outside their person's comfort zone, but not so far outside of what they can do that you're going to cause a situation where they have to fail, where it's just they have to shut down.
Yeah, and I think this gets to the leadership skill, because when you were learning ballet, you had a coach, right? You had somebody that was guiding you. There's all of us in every organization has a change capacity. It's hard to quantify sometimes, but you can actually see. You can't get from, where you are today, from a beginning student all the way to the expert professional overnight in a single step. There's a change capacity. And I like, Seth, what you said about pushing yourself to that point of vibration and kind of knowing where that is. Maybe it's a little bit further than people thought they were able to do in terms of change, but you have a longer term view of where you're headed. And then you actually plan change capacity. And this is where I like being mindful of change for change's sake is just disruptive. It's just noise. Change for impact. That's what we're trying to do. How are we going to measure this impact? What impact are we trying to create through this change? We want to improve the customer experience. We want to improve the development pace of our teams and how they're learning or growing new skills. We want to improve the capacity or automation, right? There are impacts that we're trying to create. We can measure those and actually then plan out the stepwise. What is our total change capacity, and what trade-offs do we need to make? Because we can't change everything at once. What are the changes that would have the greatest impact, right? That's the leadership skill, is to actually understand the relationship between the measures of impact, the outcomes we're trying to create, and the change capacity of our organization. And where do we start, or where do we apply that energy to deliver that ultimate outcome?
Right. Yeah. So it's actually, I mean, it's a little bit of an intricate web between some of that, like foundational psychological safety, like safe space environment that you as a leader can create, that you as a leader can rise to with your own behaviors, right? Acknowledging failures of your own in front of your team, and then also like understanding like the why behind any of these changes and trying to help people like get there, right? Yeah, Seth, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add in, Rachel, that it's important to also recognize that people have to know you care about them, right? They have to know that you actually do. There's a thing. I used to be a school teacher. I used to teach English, and there was this joke about like, English teachers only like the papers where there are lots of mistakes, because then we actually know what to do. It's like we don't like papers where everything is, where things are well written, because we don't know what to say. There's this sense of like we can sometimes as managers become excited by failure, because then we know exactly what to do. We can tell people what they did wrong. We can critique, whereas a leader who actually sets people up for success and says, I care about your success and I'm not afraid of your failure, is someone who's going to create a sense of psychological safety and growth in that. It's very exciting to be with a leader who's like, I'm going to get you up. I'm going to set you up with this thing. I don't really know if it's going to work. And also I trust that you're going to do what you do, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, I love that. Right, because there's a certain element of the unknown and experimentation that has to kind of come hand in hand with that. So that's fantastic. Switching tracks a little in from this perspective of change and leadership and getting out of your comfort zone. AI and to your point earlier, Ken, of things are evolving so phenomenally rapidly. Like, what are you actually most excited about when it comes to different applications of AI within your industry? Ken, go ahead.
Oh gosh. So I'm fortunate. I've worked in pharma and development, diagnostics, et cetera, where we actually have many years of experience of leveraging AI approaches to help build algorithms that can advance, diagnostics, can recognize things in an X-ray, can say this heart's too large, can recognize this bacteria. Like there's all kinds of things, both in human and other, life sciences, where we've been applying and it's funny to hear it referred to now as traditional AI, like traditional AI. We're that far along. And of course, now we have the excitement of generative AI, where we're taking it to another step forward. And there's a lot of applications. Now we're early days, and we're going to see a lot of advancement in the next 2-3 years. But I think it's the ultimate assistant in your pocket, right? Where I can actually, and I've got some great prompt engineers that I've worked with, both inside and outside, the companies I'm in, and who are saying, hey, I need you to write this email for me, put it in a friendly tone to Seth, offer him 3 times that we could meet next week, connect this other person or copy this other person. And you're just giving it general instructions, but it learns your style and saves you. And then you get to look at it and just go, yep, that's right. Or I want to edit something. It saves you time. So this is where I think that the near term, next year or 2 years, applications are going to be in these kinds of things that save us time, that allow us. And I talked to one lawyer, again, outside the company, but he's like, look, I'm able to review 5 times as many contracts in the same amount of time because it summarizes for me and then it tells me kind of where to go look. He's like, I'm 5 times as productive as I was. Now that might be an extreme example, but it's an interesting one. What's also interesting is where it's not a magic wand. And so we're all still finding how to leverage these tools in a way where we're still responsible for the output. But it's an assistant is kind of, I think, the best way to think about where generative AI, these opportunities are, is it's helping us accelerate the creation of content that otherwise we would have had to. I mean, I'm seeing this in software development with tools from Microsoft and GitHub and others, where Amazon, where it's writing a lot of the junk code that you have to generate to write a bigger program. And it's just freeing up developers who's like, okay, I don't have to declare variables or create tables because it does that for me. I can review it and then work on the stuff that's really hard. And that's the thing, is if it takes away some of the drudgery from us, that's where I think the assistant kind of model gets really interesting.
Yeah, right. That's fascinating to hear. I think that's pretty consistent with some of what I've heard other people say, is that there's almost this level of task-oriented, rote, repeated nature of certain behaviors that just take time, right? Like a human can only go so fast. And if the AI can help be trained and then be accurate and always have that human level supervision, then that helps. Seth and I have discussed this when it comes to coaching, right? Because at Virtual Sapiens, we're very careful to only bite off the types of feedback that we know our AI with confidence can identify and provide feedback on, so that we then free up the coach like Seth to go in and provide some of the more nuanced level feedback and coaching without having to worry about things like, well, this person's not going to come across very well because they're not framed properly and they're, not using their hands or whatever. So Seth, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have a somewhat controversial take on it. Just not because I know AI or I work with it. It's just a question of things that I'm skeptical of technology that speeds us up and supposedly saves us time, just because I think historically in the last 100 years, we've had a lot of technology that theoretically saves us time, and yet somehow we're busier than ever before. So I'm actually quite concerned that we're just going to use AI to do more, but not necessarily to be more fulfilled in the work that we do or create better work. I think about email just as a great example. Email was an invention that seemed like such a time saver. I don't have to write out a memo and put it on someone's mailbox. I can just shoot off an email. And I don't get the kind of email that Ken gets, but I know people who spend their whole day doing email. That's all they do. And and I don't know if that's actually efficient. I mean, from a communication standpoint, I worry that we would use GPT and different types of AI generated creative endeavors to almost take away the thought process that we would, the questioning that we would ask about, like, well, why are we doing this, and what is the value of this, and like, what is the value of our time, And I think I don't really, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technology. I just feel like we are getting over our skis a little bit and not really asking the question of like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? Is speed and efficiency the only thing we're interested in, or is there something else? It's like my little soapbox. There you go.
No, I mean, I think you bring up a great point in like paying attention to not getting ahead of our skis and also not getting ahead of where the technology's at, because like I still believe that to your point about email, like, and as Ken mentioned in his answer, if we can have AI help us get through some of the emails that actually do just take time and require just a little bit of prompting and intentionality, that could help free us up to do some of that more, whatever work. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing. Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22, he has a great example of this, not of AI, but of like this thinking, like what happens when AI is communicating with other AI in emails, and like we so the example he uses in the Army hospital, there's a man who, like, no one knows who he is. He's just wrapped up in bandages, and he's got one drip thing that's like clear liquid, and it's dripping into a hose, and it's going into one arm, and then he's got another hose coming out of the other arm going into another jar that's filling up with other liquid, clear liquid. And they're all like sitting around him, and they're like, this seems really inefficient. We should just eliminate the middleman and just have the jar go from that jar to that jar. Like they were like, and this is the way that I think efficiency thinking sometimes happens, is we forget, like, why am I actually emailing anybody? Like, what am I trying to communicate? And what is so hard about this? Like, rather than like make it more efficient, maybe we should actually ask ourselves, like, do we need all this communication? Is this really actually helpful? And I know that's a big question. That's a hard question, and not one that we're going to answer today, but that's just my thinking about it.
And I've seen plenty of examples of technology where that's actually the case. Now, not with AI yet, but I've seen things where digital systems speaking to each other that actually creates this kind of inefficiency of all things. And there's lots of reasons for it, but I think it is a space that we're all going to watch. And I don't disagree with all Seth's points, of course, about, we can never, I mean, this is the art of leadership, is to really be asking ourselves the questions about, again, the impacts. I'll go back to that. What are the impacts we're trying to create? And is this the best way to do it? And speed and efficiency might be one of the impacts, but probably not always the only, and sometimes not even the primary, right? We want better outcomes. Well, it's defined better, right? So we get into those questions, and that's where the human brain, at least to date, can't be replaced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Seth, you said earlier, right? Like the human brain is built to be like efficient and lazy, right? And so we can't allow that to be the reason that we're just employing these technologies. And you see it with a lot of startups in particular, right? That are just like, and now we're an AI company and we can do all this stuff with AI. And right. And you're just like, going back to your point, kind of like, okay, but like one, like what value is this actually adding for people? Right. So very much have to be thoughtful of all those concerns. So to wrap up, if there's one takeaway our listeners can do to help face, this uncertainty for themselves, and then also as leaders for their teams, like let's start with Seth. What if you can share your, biggest takeaway, and then would love to end with Ken.
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is you want to get really clear about how you feel about uncertainty. I mean, I know for myself, uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it brings up a kind of fear that I have. Like, I don't know, am I going to be able to handle this? And then remind myself that I have handled uncertainty before, that this is going to be okay, that I'm going to be okay, that even if things fall apart, I'll be okay. And that, if you can tell that to your team, if you can remind your team that, like, the goal of facing uncertainty is part of what makes life interesting. If everything was certain, life would be very, very boring. So if we can remind ourselves that not knowing is the fun of it, and you can create an environment for your team and for yourself where that is something you embrace, then people will be more in a growth mindset.
Yeah, I want to build on that and just maybe restate it just in my own, how I've seen it. The single most effective thing you can do in leadership when you want to bring your team through a time of uncertainty, talk about it. Talk about it out loud. Tell them what you're uncertain of. Tell them what questions you have. Listen to the answers. Often there's no company where all the good ideas come from the top and go down. No company exists like that. Talk about it out loud and give space for the answers and the dialogue and the conversation, and be curious about what you're going to learn from it. It's amazing. And that was really, take it back to COVID when we were all white knuckled. The thing that we did, talked about it, shared whatever information we could share, right? Checked in repeatedly. Don't just do it once. Make it a practice. And it really is, that's, I think, the heart of creating that psychological safety to get through these times. And it does require a level of vulnerability and authenticity as a leader. That, here's the other thing, you're going to find that the more you talk about it, the more comfortable you get with it, just like anything else. It just takes practice.
Yep. Building those new muscles and new habits, right? Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights and your thoughts and your experiences with us today. I'd love it if one of you, maybe Seth, if you want to just share a little more about how people can get in touch with you and with you both, but also specifically with your podcast, which I just think really explores in great depth some of these topics.
I'm actually going to pass that to Ken. Ken is expert at listing off all the ways.
Yeah, so you can find out more about it. It's Not Personal is the name of the podcast about leadership and creating a more, ironically or coincidentally, human workspace by taking the ego out of leadership. And the conversations we have explores, as Rachel said, many of the topics that we touched on today and a bunch more, with a lot of examples that we've both seen in our work, our lives, and our teams that are a lot of fun. So we would welcome you to. You can find it wherever you find your podcast goodness, Apple, Spotify, etc. It's also at www.itsnotpersonal.net. You can find it as well through Seth's website, SethRigoletti.com, where you can find more about his recent book that he published, Into the Wolf. I can't help but brag a little bit, which is some great stories about leadership and really finding your own voice in that space. So we love feedback. We love emails. You can email either of us. All the links are on the websites. We love questions, and actually have brought a lot of that into the discussion of the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you again so much. And thanks to our audience. Great.